And 3, 2, 1.
Action.
Thanks, PJ. It's PJ here again. That's right, the founder and chairman of the Filipino food movement. I'm joined by two fantastic authors, Keesa Ocampo and Allie Cuerdo, and we're going to be having a discussion about Filipino cookbooks. Hello, Keesa. Hello, Allie.
What's up, PJ? Allie, so good to see you both.
Hi, how's it going?
So, Allie, you're joining us from New York, and Keesa, you're here in the Bay Area, so we've got the U.S. covered from coast to coast. So you're ready to talk a little bit about cookbooks?
I don't know about a little bit. I think talk about it a lot. I'm ready.
Awesome. When we were preparing for this, I asked my mom, what is the oldest cookbook you have? And she pointed to a cookbook that was given to her by my grandmother. And this is a book that a lot of us are familiar with. It's called Let's Cook with Nora. The cool thing is that this is a first edition that I was able to find. And it's in really, really rough shape, but you can see kind of the illustrations and things here. It's kind of a monotone book. But one of the cool things about this book is that it speaks of its vintage. This copy was published in 1965. Actually with the help of the General Milk Company of the Philippines. And it lists itself as a treasury of Filipino, Chinese, and European dishes. Mm. And that's kind of where I want to start. It kind of seems like this book from the 1960s set an interesting trajectory for how people experience our cuisine. Can you talk a little bit about that?
First of all, I want to say that every household has a Let's Cook with Nora cookbook. I remember when I moved here, that was one of the few things that I brought with me from the Philippines. And, interestingly enough, the fact that it's blended with so many other cuisines, right? Like, I think that it really put us on the path of being able to have a very broad and varied profile of food at home. This is what Filipino home cooking looks like. One night you can have sinigang and adobo, and the next night you can be having chicken a la king.
My God. I think that will remind a lot of people who, especially Filipinos who grew up in the States, what a varied menu would look like, specifically what you eat at your house and then what you eat at your friend's house down the street, like peas, carrots, roast chicken. What is this? Allie, did you ever have any experiences like that growing up, the food otherism?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's funny because what you're describing, that experience of really eating the food in your own house and then eating food at all your other friends' houses, it's basically what Alvin and I talk about in AMBOY, the idea of being both Filipino. And what is that experience like? That experience encompasses your Mexican friends. It encompasses your friends from New Orleans. I mean, literally all parts of the world. And I think that is actually what makes Filipino food so exciting to me right now, is this globalism and this multiculturalism, and the fact that we really are seeing this new generation of chefs that is not only drawing from their own personal experiences, but their experiences in professional kitchens, their experiences traveling all over the world.
That's interesting. And we're going to get back to AMBOY, don't you worry. It makes me also think of how when you take a book like Let's Cook with Nora and its attempt to sell the cuisine, I think some of the marketing materials from the era said, put some festive spice and pizzazz in your dinner. It's kind of telling of most cookbooks of the time. It was meant to be lighthearted. It didn't appear to take much real care for the origins of the dishes, just so long as it tasted good. And I guess that's a fair start. And what you had mentioned also, Allie, was that there's this new generation of writers and chefs who are exploring things in a different way. So kind of coming up to the modern era. So Let's Cook with Nora was 1965. Let's flash back into the 21st century here. In 2006, there are two great books that came out. The first one is The Governor General's Kitchen by Dr. Feliz Santamaria. And that one, for anybody that hasn't read that one, pick that up. It describes Filipino cuisine and customs back through the 16th century. But we also had Memories of Filipino Kitchens with Amy Bessa. These are the first two books that I can remember that had a huge impact on how I viewed the food that I eat and just my own confusing identity as a Filipino-American. What can you speak to about that confusing upbringing and how this generation of authors like Yana Gilbuena, Nicole Ponseco, how are they navigating this identity challenge?
Something that I have really noticed is that, when you take a look at the 1965 publication of Let's Cook with Nara, again, like it was a very kind of nebulous presentation of what we have as Filipino cuisine, right? And in a huge way, it really impacted what we as a Filipino nation really understood our food to be. This was the content of the kitchens of our childhood. But when you fast forward into the 2000s and you start to see the publications of Amy and the Governor General's kitchen, it's really more of like a reclamation of what is truly ours. It's really a presentation of Filipino cuisine without diluting it. And then when you come more into the last decade, you take a look at the cookbooks of, Yana Gilbuena, Nicole, you take a look at AMBOY, you take a look at the cookbook that we're coming out with. It's really more of like presenting Filipino cuisine with a story of our globalism. And I think that if the effect of the Let's Cook with Nora cookbook was to give us a more nebulous idea of what our home cooking should look like, then my God, like the entire batch of cookbooks that are now coming out, hopefully, will set the tone for what we want the kitchens of the future generation to look like. They're prideful. They're very representative of the entirety of our cuisine, not just what was popular in Metro Manila, but what is found in Mindanao, what was pre-colonial, what is Filipino-Mexican, what is Southern American Filipino, and all of that combined. So I think the prospect for the next generation and what our future kitchens will look like is really, really gorgeous.
I like that you kind of draw this line from what marketing the cuisine so that it was acceptable or understandable or what have you. And now we have this generation of authors, like you mentioned, Yana Gilbuena. Her book is called No Forks Given. It catalogs her travels around the world, bringing traditional Filipino Kamayan meals to different cultures. My favorite thing about that whole collection of stories is that Filipino food is just as compatible with anywhere else. And yet that confusion is always the part that tends to surprise people. It's like, if it were this good and I just put it in my mouth, I wouldn't have had all of these questions. And so what you're speaking to with this upcoming generation of books is building on these bridges that Nicole and Yana and Amy Bessa put together, because they're the ones that I feel like turn the tide from let's sell it, let's get people to accept it, to forget getting people to accept it. This is what it is. This is what it is to me. Allie, yeah, I wanted to throw this one to you because I think AMBOY does touch a lot on that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can say about the three amazing authors you just mentioned, I'm very lucky to have worked with actually each and every one of them in the process of making ulam. So both Amy Bessa and Nicole Ponseco, we interviewed for ulam, which, side note, is now on Amazon Prime.
Which on my recommended list.
Thank you. That's very recent. That's just this summer. And honestly, both of them are pioneers, truly pioneers. I mean, with Amy, I could go on and on. She's lectured all over the world and still teaches, in the Philippines as well, specifically about the regionalism of Filipino cuisine, and really has an emphasis on the ingredients and really getting fresh ingredients brought to the States so that we can kind of make dishes that are more like the dishes you would see in the Philippines. Now, that's Amy, and Amy's awesome. Nicole has a totally different take. Nicole's take is very, I would say, bold. You know, Nicole
Yeah.
brought, I think, Filipino food to the East Village in a way that no one had seen before. You know, what is a Filipino gastropub, right? And that's Jeepney. You know, I think that Jeepney as a restaurant has done so much work for Filipino cuisine around the world, purely because of the way it's presented and where it's presented. It's in a very high traffic area. People truly from all over the world come to New York City and they come to that restaurant and they try Filipino food for the first time. And that is a landmark on its own. And now Yana is almost, I would say, like a missionary. You know, she is bringing the gospel of Kamayan truly all over the world. And we were very, very lucky to have her on our Ulam Australia tour. She actually came with us to both Sydney and Melbourne, and we did full-fledged Kamayan pop-ups, hundreds of people, and a lot of those people, it was the first time they had had Filipino food. And so to be greeted with Yana's spread, I mean, she's truly the queen of Kamayan. And so, you know, to see this array of food and this format that I feel like a lot of non-Filipinos have not experienced, which is Kamayan, right? Which is the boodle fight, eating with your hands. That community, I think, really converted people overnight. You know, like instantly. The minute you take that rice and that fish and you put it in your mouth, it's like, ah, it's just like angels, you know? And I think that it's really cool to see these three very different takes on Filipino food. Now, Alvin, I mean, obviously, I'll let the book speak for itself because it's coming out at the end of the month. I think August 26th, to be specific. But Alvin has his own story, and I think Alvin's story is really interesting because he was really an AMBOY. You know, he grew up in America, a latchkey kid eating Filipino food, but also eating what we call Costco food, you know, chicken tenders, you know, Tyson patties, you know, and that is also part of the process. You know, when he's 6, he's making cheeseburger lumpia, which is now really fun and trendy, but for him, it was just kind of this natural progression into, okay, I have lumpia, I love lumpia, I also like cheeseburgers, and I'm both Filipino and American. You know, how does that translate in my food, in my play, and in my experimentation?
Yeah, I love that. It's like lumpia as a vessel.
But I mean, I could go on.
Something that I noticed is that, you know, when you started talking about Amy and you ended with Alvin, something that I really love is that the cookbook of Amy really taught us about technique. And what Alvin taught us, or will be teaching the world, is that it's also about working with what's available. And so much of those two schools of thought are really the hallmarks and the pillars of what Filipino cuisine truly is. I think for a long time, there was almost like a shame or the hiya around our food because, you know, we don't really use a lot of spices. It's, for the most part, it's maybe like what, salt, pepper, souring agent, vinegar, soy sauce, and voila, you have like, you can have many different things, right? With like different variations of those. But what we learned is it's also because, and this was from a conversation that I had with Cloud Tayag, the reason that we cook with such simple ingredients is because we let the ingredient itself shine. Because in the Philippines, seafood was always fresh, right? A lot of the vegetables that people would cook with, you know, specifically in Kapampangan cuisine, probably grew out in your backyard. So the ingredients really didn't need a lot. And it was a lot about how do you take an ingredient or a vegetable and allow that to shine and not necessarily mask it with flavors of other things. But at the same time, Filipino cuisine too is about using what's available. And that's exactly what Alvin teaches us. That if you first understand the technique, then Filipino food really has no boundaries.
I want to keep on going on with the ingredient challenges that you brought up. The book that you're working on, Cuisinero, focuses on a couple of chefs that are actually in the Gulf region, right? Well, throughout most of the Gulf region, pork has its own section in the grocery store, because it's seen as unclean or untouchable. How do they navigate these challenges? Hard enough in the US and parts of Europe, but in the Middle East, how do they express Filipino cuisine with the ingredients they have?
So that's a great question because, to operate as a business in the Middle East, you actually need a pork license to sell pork, which is like the favorite protein in so much of Filipino cooking. But here you'll see that the chefs that we're working with on the book, Chef John Buenaventura and patissier Nouel Omamalin, actually take a lot of our cooking techniques, some of our ingredients, like, Nouel does pastry, so he does a lot of the, you'll see like, the yema, the ube, the barako coffee, really just kind of, I can't even say it was just elevated. That's almost like undercutting it. Noel literally took our food to Jupiter.
Wow.
And, on the other hand, you see John's style of cooking where, obviously there are a lot of substitutions. You'll see, traditional dishes that are made with buffalo, with chicken, with seafood. But PJ, something that we have to understand is that's actually, in a nutshell, what Filipino cuisine is about. So many of what we call our national dishes can actually never be codified. Like there's no one way to make a dish. Why? Because adobo, sigang, and kilaw are actually not names of dishes. They're names of techniques. And when you first understand that, then it kind of gives you this like openness and this big like aha, right? When you say adobo, it's not necessarily a dish. It actually means to braise something in vinegar. So, when you see adobos that maybe have turmeric or maybe that have onions or maybe that are like maputla or pale because there's no soy sauce in it, you can't necessarily say that it's not adobo because the technique is to braise in vinegar. When you say kilaw, it means to prepare something without fire, without charcoal, but it's cooked in a citric acid or in a souring agent like, calamansi, etc., or vinegar. When you say sigang, it literally means the process of boiling something in salted water with a souring agent. So doesn't that just like open your mind and like make you instantly so much more accepting?
It's like when the French culinary masters are the ones that codified for the rest of the world most of the cooking techniques. So I love that when we can draw the parallel between the two, then we can rely on it for what it is. It's a technique and it's not a standard. And if we can get away from that, I think we're going to find a lot more cooperation.
Exactly. And then I think from that discussion point, it actually makes you appreciate how sophisticated Filipino cuisine actually is. Mm-hmm. Even with just the salt and pepper and vinegar and, and heat like chilies, how sophisticated it actually is, right?
I absolutely agree. I actually just got off the phone with Angela de Mayuga and Ligaya Michan of the New York Times, and they were saying pretty much exactly the same thing, which is that, Filipino food has been really portrayed in the West as very, I would say, rustic. It's seen as this very, I don't know, it's sort of looked down on, I would say. Yeah. It's been portrayed in the West in that way. And if you look at the ingredients and you look at the techniques, they're actually quite complex and they're actually quite amazing, and really beautiful. And, as Keesa was saying, French food, right, is sort of seen as like where the ingredients shine. But I think that in Filipino food, the ingredients do truly shine. And Amy Bessa, I think, has really also spread this gospel that when you go to the Philippines and you have access to those ingredients, you really understand more sort of the heart and the intent of these original dishes. That said, there are how many islands in the Philippines?
7,107, depending on the tide.
And
Miss Universe answer, by the way.
and that's what I'm saying, is that there are over 7,000 islands. Of course, there are over 7,000 ways to make adobo. Of course, there is regionalism. If you look at, for example, white adobo, right? Things that people, I have been told that white adobo does not exist. And yet, if you talk to Clan Garcia in the Philippines, who takes people on food tours to the south of the Philippines, she will show you, this is where white adobo comes from. This is the region, this is the place, because there are a lot of coconuts, because there is an overabundance of fresh coconut milk. You know, you start to really dig into these dishes and you realize that they're created based on the region, you know, that they originate in. And I think it's interesting because obviously even in language, right, we are so diverse. Tagalog is only one dialect in the Philippines. And in the same way, you know, the cuisine from, I would say, Luzon is really the cuisine that maybe has crossed over more in the US, but it's not at all the only type of Filipino cuisine.
And it's funny you mentioned in terms of dialects, while Tagalog, or rather Filipino, which is the kind of mix of Tagalog and English, that's one of the official languages. I believe the last I checked, Visayan is the most spoken dialect in the Philippines.
There you go.
There's so many different methods in the Visayas. I think it might be one of the great unexplored parts of Philippine cuisine. Even Claude Tayag in his book Linam Nam had a hard time. I mean, it's so many. He did his best, but there's just too many. So there's so much more to be discovered. Now, Allie, your talk with Ligaya and Angela, that is going to be available on the Filipino Food Movement webpage and YouTube channel. And they also have a book coming out. It's an untitled Filipinx cookbook that's coming out next year. Is that right?
Yes. I'm really excited for it because, of course, as you know, both of these amazing women have had storied careers. I mean, I could just talk all day about them because I'm personally a huge fan. But Ligaya Machan, as some people know, is an incredible writer over at the New York Times, has covered Filipino food, Asian food, and honestly, all kinds of food all over New York City and all over the world for many years now. She is Hapa and grew up in Hawaii and is also Filipino. And Angela de Mayuga as well has had an incredible career, first coming up, I think, like truly bursting into the public sphere as an executive, and then has branched out and become, I would just say, like a one-woman powerhouse in New York City, and has really introduced a lot of people into what I call a very complex and nuanced view of Filipino food. And then, of course, you know, since I have to plug one of my good friends, Alvin Cailan, you know, his version of Filipino food is also really informed by his career. Some people know, but a surprising amount of people don't know, that he is the brain and the bronze behind Eggslut, which is one of the, if not the most Instagrammed restaurant in America, which still blows my mind, and now has many locations all over the world, including in Vegas and also in the Middle East. So it's really interesting to see how you have Filipino chefs succeeding not just at Filipino cuisine, but oftentimes at other cuisine, quote unquote, right? American cuisine, Chinese cuisine, Korean cuisine. I mean, really, you have Filipino chefs that are excellent, that are really behind the scenes a lot of the time. And I noticed that also while making ulam.
That's a good point.
Are you seeing the trend here? First of all, there are a bunch of people whose careers have really been rooted in the media and in storytelling. And now there's like a shift and a very specific interest in our Filipino cuisine. I mean, as you guys already know, Allie is the director behind the very, very successful documentary Ulam, which is now available on Amazon Prime. I'm actually an executive producer and content creator myself, and my show, Discovering Roots, is also available on Amazon Prime. You have the writer in Ligaya and in Angela. A while ago, we were talking about how so much of the cuisine from Luzon was really what has shined internationally. But when we think about what happened to the cuisine of the South, I think a lot of why we don't know so much or enough about it is because it wasn't really documented. And I think the fact that now you have Filipinx writers and people in the media that are taking these stories, putting the stories behind the food and pushing them out into the world, for me is just, it feels like a whole era of birthing, and I'm so in love with it. I'm so proud to be part of it, you know?
I agree. It's really exciting. And I do think, especially in the last few months, the world has turned upside down, you know, between I would call it the two pandemics, between the coronavirus pandemic and between the racial shifts and the racial pandemic that's happened in the United States, specifically regarding the death of George Floyd. I think that the world is really finally, after so many years, starting to stand up and pay attention to what has previously been marginalized. And I think that Filipino voices in the media and Asian American voices in the media have really been looked down upon and marginalized and othered for quite some time now. And I think that it is really about time that we have our stories centered in this space. And I think that it's really not just exciting, but it is a personal point of pride for me, that I hope that my kids and my children's children will be able to grow up and have heroes that look like them. And I think that is something that I'm so proud to contribute to, and I'm so proud to be joined in by my fellow Filipino brothers and sisters and my fellow siblings, by Keesa, by PJ, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to cry right now, but like for reals, you know, it matters, because I grew up in a world in which that was not the case. And I think that representation is unbelievably important.
I think that pretty much sums it all up. The world is upside down. There's new opportunities abound alongside new challenges. And we have a fantastic bevy of women authors just coming up and killing it, especially you two. So I want to thank both of you for joining me for the Culinaria Book Club discussion. So for everyone else, we are of course joined by filmmaker, writer, director Allie Cuerdo, whose book AMBOY comes out at the end of this month, and also joined by the illustrious Emmy Award-winning Keesa Ocampo, whose book is Cuisinero, coming out on August the 15th. So please make sure to follow the Filipino food movement on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and check out all the other great book recommendations and other content we have online. Thanks again to both of you. And this is PJ Quesada signing off.